Welcome to Ottoman Empire Radio TV, and today's topic is on modern Islamic terrorism, starting with the horrible Armenian Genocide. And we welcome again Brother Alexis Bonello to the show.
Thank you, AJ. Always glad to be on Ordo Militaris Radio TV, breaking new horizons in independent Catholic media in the English-speaking world, to talk about a topic that is rarely talked about in Catholic media, but needs to be talked about, because unless we realize there is a threat, we'll never prepare to defend ourselves.
What really starts getting things kicked off here is some early treaties before the modern times. The first one, so-called Peace of Amasya from 1555, and the Treaty of Zuhab, 1639. Well, what are these things?
Okay, so Armenia is an ancient kingdom that is situated in what we would call today modern Turkey on the far east of the country, or modern Iran on the far northwest corner of the country, the land between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, around the lake Yerevan, in that part of the world where it is said that Noah's Ark rested after the flood. And the Armenians have lived there for at least 3,000 years. Okay, and they're the first kingdom to become Christian in the 3rd century AD. And there have been Armenians there from ancient times. And they're devout Christian people. They disagreed with one of the early ecumenical councils, and soon fell out of they were allies of the Byzantine Empire for a long time, the Greek Orthodox Roman Empire, and they were allies of the Crusaders. They're some of the strongest allies of the Crusaders during the crusading period. But in modern times, what happened was that just before the beginning of the Crusader period, a tribe from Central Asia known as the Seljuk Turks invaded Persia and then migrated west into Asia Minor. And they tried to take all of Asia Minor from the Byzantines. The first Crusaders subdued them a great amount and drove them out to a certain extent. But after the Crusaders had left the Mideast, one tribe of that group of Turks, called the Ottomans, set up their own little state in Asia Minor, which we now call Turkey, and slowly conquered all of Asia Minor and all of the other Turkish tribes, and set up what was called the Ottoman Empire. And in the Ottoman Empire, the head of it claimed to be the Caliph, okay, or the Sultan, who had the authority of the Caliph. As we mentioned yesterday, in Islamic political ideology, the head of all Muslims is supposed to be a physical descendant of Muhammad, and he has the title of Caliph. But the Turks are not physical descendants of Muhammad, and they have no claim to call themselves Caliph, so they call themselves Sultan, but they claim the same authority. And in the 1500s, they began conquering large parts of the Mideast, North Africa, and they entered into conflict with the Islamic state of Persia. And at the Peace of Amasya in 1555, they were given control over the Armenian territory. The Armenians already had been subjected to the Muslims in that era. They weren't politically independent for the most part. And then in the Treaty of Eastern Zuhab, they permanently divided Eastern Armenia from them. So part of Armenia traditionally goes into what we would call northern Iraq, or parts of Iran today, or Azerbaijan, and part was taken by the Turks. So the Turks for 500 years have ruled this territory more or less, and that sets the basic historical situation in Armenia.
Some terms now. First, what is the Armenian millet?
So in the Ottoman system, minorities were, in a certain sense, self-governing, and each self-governing unit was called a millet, and the Armenian millet were all the Armenians, and they were governed either by the Armenian Apostolic Church, which is the Catholics, or the Armenian Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Armenian Catholic or the Armenian Apostolic, Armenian Protestant. So the Armenians were divided religiously. Some of them from the time of the Crusaders and onward had reunited with the Catholic Church and accepted the Council of, I think it was Ephesus is what they divided over, or Constantinople II. Others remained Orthodox, so-called. They don't use the term Orthodox, they use the term Apostolic. And some in modern times became Protestant under the influence of Swedish missionaries. But they each were allowed to kind of a self-governing. That didn't mean they weren't persecuted, but it did mean that, generally speaking, they had someone in their community who had political authority over them who was an Armenian and who was reported to the Ottoman government.
The Armenian community up to 1878 was massive. How many were poor and what caused them to be, and also who were the wealthy?
Yes, there was probably 2 or 3 million Armenians in the Ottoman Empire at the end of the 19th century. Exactly how many is hard to determine. The Armenian people in recent centuries have distinguished themselves by being extremely peaceful, humble people that submitted to Ottoman rule and didn't take up arms in rebellions of that sort. Although the Armenians in the past, in ancient times, were a rather belligerent people. The Romans had the hardest time conquering them, and the Persians couldn't conquer them. And they were some of the fiercest fighters alongside the Crusaders, as I mentioned. But in recent centuries, by the constant oppression of Islamic rule, being beaten down by dimitude, which is the idea that you're an inferior and therefore you should submit, they became very passive. But being peaceful is a Christian virtue, so it comes easier to us, even though sometimes we practice it to excess. So many of them were very poor. Armenia is the high mountains. If you had to compare it to any part of the United States, for example, you'd have to compare it to like Idaho without the fertility of the land, or the western part of Colorado, and eastern part of Oregon or Washington. We're talking about the high Rockies here, or maybe the western part of Montana. Very mountainous, deep valleys, beautiful land, mostly for pasturing, raising of horses, cattle, sheep. The Armenians are famous for their cooking of vegetables, and great traders, because Armenia is an important part of the world where goods are of great value on all sides are being transported one side to the other. And since they've been living in the land from ancient times and have been Christians for more than 17 centuries, the land was beautifully adorned with more than 2,000, I'd say more than 2,000, probably 5,000 churches and more than 300 monasteries. Not to mention a whole series of castles they had built over the centuries, which were taken by Ottomans and turned into military garrisons. Many of them, though, were very poor people, because under the Ottoman millet system, you could not, if you were Armenian, you could not ride a horse or a donkey. You had to remain on foot. Your house couldn't be higher or bigger than a Muslim neighbor. There were certain things you could not bear testimony against a Muslim in any kind of conflict other than a commercial contract. And so you were basically discriminated against in every possible way. Their churches couldn't ring bells. Can you imagine Christian churches for 500 years, they couldn't ring their bells? Perhaps the saddest of all is the Armenian people didn't have any Christians anywhere else in the world that allied with them, came to the aim, or sought to liberate them. So they lived this oppressive condition for 500 years, and they became very weak in almost every capacity to resist. So when the persecution breaks out, most of them don't even resist. They go to their death. They have no way to resist. They weren't allowed to own guns, for example, or weapons of any kind. They weren't allowed to even take up arms against Muslims. That was considered already a crime, even if the Muslim was unjustly persecuting you. And in the Ottoman system, they were generally robbed, defrauded, overtaxed, exploited, and suffered all manners of injustices from Muslims under Ottoman rule, and there's no legal recourse they could have.
In the 1870s, the murders began. Why did the Kurds and Circassians go into these neighborhoods and kill, rape, and pillage?
Okay, so the Kurds are an Islamic people who call themselves a tribe, originate in northeastern Iran, and didn't like being ruled by the Muslims in Iran who are Persian of racial stock. And they've emigrated, they still live in northwest Iran, but they've emigrated in recent centuries into parts of what we now call northern Iraq or western Turkey. They're notorious about stealing other people's lands and threatening people to get out of villages so they can steal their houses. And they're notorious for that. Everyone in the region complains about it, and they take pride in robbing other people's property. So they're you would call a tribe of bandits. And modern times they're heavily dominated by Marxist ideology. But the Circassians are for a people who derive from former slaves taken from the Ukraine and forced to convert to Islam and made soldiers in the Ottoman Empire. And Circassians are some of the most, not all of them, but some of them are the most bitter persecutors of Christians because they are ex-Christians themselves. And it's kind of like you have to prove who you are by being cool. But the problems for the Armenians in modern times begins with the wars in the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire wasn't modernizing. It wasn't in a part of the world that had good mineral reserves. And so consequently, with the rise of the Industrial Revolution in Europe and the ability to obtain many better armaments, guns, and wealth and opportunities, the Christians of the Balkans is that peninsula between Italy and the Black Sea, which contains the countries of Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, Romania, the former Yugoslavia, to name some modern countries. The peoples there who are Christians and had been under bitter Ottoman rule since the 1500s, the 1400s, and the 1300s decided to start freedom movements where they started wars of independence. The Greeks were the first, and the Bulgarians and the Serbs followed suit until, so in the end of the 19th century, you have 3 Balkan wars where the Christians of the Balkans were expelling the Turk Ottoman rule and taking the former Ottoman territory in the Balkan Peninsula for their own peoples. Those 3 wars led to the expulsion of many Muslims and Circassians and Turks and Ottomans from the Balkans, and they had really nowhere to go in Turkey except eastern Turkey, where the land was cheap and they could at least buy something. But when they came to that part of Turkey, they were much wealthier than the Armenians, so they became a dominant ruling class in the area. And this sets up the crisis, because where did all these immigrants going to go, and whose land are they going to take? And the Armenians were seen as pushovers and quick picking.
Yeah. Well, talk about how the Kurds are in the modern times. That video we were told about, we watched, and you said share this on Facebook. right when we hit post, we lost our Facebook accounts.
Yeah, that was like what, November of 2016. That was the first censorship that
Yeah.
Militaris Católicas suffered, and Facebook showed itself to be viciously anti-Christian because the video talked about how the Kurds in Iraq were persecuting Christians. Okay. I now understand that the reason why our page was banned is that the Kurds are communists and Facebook is communist. And any criticism of the communist allies is staunchly crushed on Facebook. And so ever since that, Facebook has had me on a watch list. Just 2 months ago, I tried to start a personal Facebook page and I was banned in the first 3 hours permanently from Facebook because I uploaded a Christian flag that had the cross on it. That was considered a violation of community standards, and your activity is suspicious and threatening violence to other people.
Uh-huh.
So that's how whacked out Facebook is. And if you're spending your time, your social media time on Facebook, you are living within a Marxist, Jewish, controlled, tyrannical state. That whereas if you say anything, they can destroy your existence socially. And so you're practicing dimitude. You've joined a ideologic system where you're going to be an inferior and shut your mouth and say only what Mark Zuckerberg wants. And that's, if you can imagine what it's like, because you so easily accept it, you can imagine what the Armenians were living under, which was under 100 times worse in the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah. What is the Great Eastern Crisis and what countries did it affect?
The thing in Islam is this, is that not all Muslims want to conquer the world with jihad, but almost all of them agree that if a non-Muslim attacks them, they should organize together and fight back in a jihad. So beginning with the Russian-Turkish War of 1877-1878, where Russia defeats the Ottoman Empire, should be really called the Russia-Ottoman Empire, sentiment starts rising in the Ottoman Empire that they should fight back against Christians. Okay, and usually, and the Turks are a very, as a people, they're not known to be honest. Okay, they're not known to be forgiving, and they're not known to be just. They're vindictive. They have a strong, deep cultural tradition of vindictiveness. So when they lose wars against Christian powers, usually in the years following, they persecute the Christians in their own empire. The Ottomans did that, and that's what they did after the Russia-Turkish War. They saw Armenians as a threat. The Russians wanted to protect them and wanted an item in the treaty of that peace, the Treaty of San Stefanos, which was signed on 3rd of March 1878, which made Russia the protector of the Armenian people, because as an Orthodox people, and Russia being Orthodox, the Tsar felt strongly he should protect the Armenian people. God bless him for that.
Yeah.
And so the item in the treaty wasn't so well worded, and once it did get in the treaty, well, the British objected.
Yeah.
So that begins what's called the Armenian question, because Russia wanted to make sure the Armenians would be protected and not persecuted.
Yeah. Let's see. First, what is this Treaty of Paris? And did it give France and UK the right to intervene and protect Christian minorities?
Okay, the Treaty of Paris, I'll say. So the Treaty of Paris is the British objected to what was going on with the Russian-Turkish War because the Allied powers, the Masonic states of the West, France, Great Britain, Italy, didn't want Russia, an Orthodox non-Masonic nation, to expand its power into the Mideast, where they would have strong support, and crush Islam, which was a strong ally, as we said yesterday, of the Masonic world order. So they objected to this term in the treaty, and they tried to get it renegotiated, into which it meant nothing at all. And so the Allies at the Peace Conference of Paris are involved in the same sort of thing, giving lip service to helping the Armenians, but really leaving the question in such a way that the Turks could always find a way out and not help them at all. And this was a very subtle, Masonic, underhanded way of helping the Ottomans and the Turks persecute Christians in a way that could only be seen by historians decades after, because it was so subtle. And this is how Freemasons work. They always tell you they're going to do something, but they don't really do it. They tell you they're going to help Christians emigrate to the United States who are being persecuted by Islam, but once they get in power, they reduce Christian immigration by 90%. And who did that? Do I have to say his name? Okay, I don't have to say his name. That's totally Masonic, and that's how you know that person is a Freemason, because they're a two-faced liar.
All right. Next massacre, the Hamidian massacre.
So after the Treaty of Berlin is signed, which puts an end to the war between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, the Ottomans start seeing the Armenians as their enemy, because in Islam, there's no capacity to forgive or tolerate, because it's not a religion from God. It's not based on humility or justice or repentance. It's based on vindictiveness, revenge, and persecution of the other, blaming the other for everything. So they started to see that since all these European powers were demanding they treat the Armenians better, they did the exact opposite. They're going to start to treat them worse, okay, because that's how vindictive they are. And that's how most Muslim nations would react. If you tell them not to persecute Christians, they'll persecute them even more, because they're just not religiously capable of any other reaction except being vindictive. They see it as a threat that you're telling them what to do. If you tell a Muslim what to do, that's what's probably most likely to get him mad. He will get absolutely mad. He could be very friendly. I'll just give you an example. Here in Rome, I go to a grocery store. It's run by a Muslim, and he's very friendly. But in the scale he uses to weigh all the vegetables is normally filthy. So I said, you know, you'll get more customers if you keep your scale nice and clean. He went from being very friendly to being very angry at me, just like that, because he's not a Christian, and I shouldn't have assumed he's a Christian. Okay, a Christian would say, you know, you're right, but a Muslim, no. How dare you, a non-Muslim, tell me what to do? You know? And so they begin what's called the Hamidian massacres. Sultan Abdulhamid II, the Ottoman ruler, didn't want to implement the Treaty of Berlin in those points which said he should treat Armenians better. So he creates a paramilitary outfit known as the Hamidiyye, which was made up of Kurdish irregulars to deal with Armenians as they wish. So this is like a Ottoman version of the SS. And they provoked rebellions of Armenians as a pretext for persecuting them. For example, in Sassoon in 1894 and in Zaytun in 1895, these regiments were used increasingly to deal with Armenians by way of oppression and massacre. In some instances, Armenians successfully fought off the regiments, and in 1895 brought the excesses to the attention of the great powers, who subsequently condemned the Sultan for his actions. He was forced to sign a new reform package, but he never implemented it. And on October 1st, 1895, 2,000 Armenians assembled in Constantinople, petitioned for implementation of the reforms. But the Sultan sent the police against them and to beat them up. Soon after that, the Ottoman government precipitated massacres of Armenians in Constantinople and in the provinces of Bitlis, Diyarbakir, Erzurum, Harput, and Sivas. That's eastern Turkey, what we call Armenia, Trebizond, and Van. Estimates differ, but it's scholars say between 100,000 and 300,000 Armenians were massacred by the Ottoman government as an act of revenge for having been told by the European powers to treat them better. That's how vicious. You're going to see in this, you'll probably get a a gut reaction that you just hate Turks after our report today. But let's explain that it's not the Turkish people doing this, it's only some of the Turkish people. Just like the Nazis were German, but not all the Germans participated in Nazi atrocities, okay? So make that distinction from the beginning. So we're not anti-Turkish here, we're just anti-genociders, okay? Because genocide is a horrible crime against any people, whether they're Christian or not. And to kill 100 to 300,000 of the citizens of your own empire simply because you're told to treat them better is the most vicious human behavior possible. It's not even human, it's subhuman.
When does the Ottoman Empire become modern Turkey as we know today?
So even before the First World War breaks out, the Ottoman Empire is suffering internal problems. They already lost Egypt to rebellion. They lost North Africa. They're having troubles controlling Mesopotamia, what we call Iraq today, Syria. Their territory technically went all the way down to Medina in the Saudi Peninsula. So there was founded a group, a revolutionary group called the Young Turks. The Young Turks are a Masonic organization among the Turkish people. They push nationalism, although they embrace Islam. Unlike Christianity, Freemasonry is very acceptable to Islam because they are both technically monotheistic, but both completely psychopathic and immoral organizations. The only difference is that Freemasonry tends to be secret societies and Islam tends to be public, okay? Although obviously they're not the same religion, but they have similar morals. So Freemasonry spread rapidly to the Islamic world through a lodge founded in Istanbul called the Grand Orient, which is one of the most powerful Masonic lodges in the world after that of the one of Paris and London. And the Young Turks on the 24th of July, 1908, staged a coup d'etat in the Third Army at Salonika, which is in modern day Greece, but at that time was part of the Ottoman Empire. They wanted a reform administration. They wanted to renew the decadent Ottoman state, but they really wanted just to grab power for themselves. They initially said that they wanted better treatment for minorities and used that trick to garnish the support of all kinds of minorities in the Ottoman Empire who were not Turks. And that was what the Young Turk movement was. However, in the Young Turk movement, there was a secret revolutionary organization, which was the real arm or spirit of the Young Turk movement. And they call themselves the Committee of Union and Progress. What a lovely name that is, Union and Progress. What do they mean by that? The total and utter extermination of the Armenian people. And we're talking about the Armenian Genocide today, but we have to remember that the Syriac and Assyrian Christians in the Ottoman Empire were also targeted, and hundreds of thousands of them were also murdered. So this wasn't just an Armenian genocide, it was a Christian genocide, because it was Christians who were targeted. And so that's how the modern state of Turkey now, as the Ottoman Empire in the First World War, is transformed into the modern state of Turkey. It starts falling apart. The Young Turks gain control of the authority. And right after the end of World War I, when the Ottoman Empire is conquered by the Allied powers of Russia, France, Italy, Germany, the empire falls and the Young Turks proclaim the modern secular state of Turkey. Okay, that's where the word Turkey comes from. It comes from the Young Turk movement.
Now, is the modern Young Turks the same group, and should governments today be worried and kick them out?
Yeah, so Turkey today is still run by the Young Turk movement. They're not as, they're more the secularists than the Islamists. Erdogan began as someone who accepted their their ideas, but now he seeks support more among the radical Islamists who want to return Turkey to an Islamic state, not a secular state. But the Young Turks, by their action in the Armenian Genocide, fully qualify as a Nazi-like party. They never, however, were labeled as a terrorist organization or a Nazi-like organization by the world powers, and that's because they were a Masonic organization and had the full backing, though unsaid, from all the Masonic countries in Western Europe. And that's why they've been allowed to persecute the Turkish people and the Christian people of Asia Minor for more than a century with absolute impunity. And so that reason is, yes, they are an organization that should be looked on with great suspicion and not accorded they should be looked on like the Islamic Brotherhood or the Muslim Brotherhood in that way. But they're more Masonic than they are Islamic, the Young Turks.
I just say that because I think there's a group of them here in America as well.
Well, the United States being a Masonic country, it's not surprising that any Turks who emigrate here would join the Young Turks. They tend to be a nationalistic organization, just like the Nazis claimed that make Germany great again, and the Young Turks were about making Turkey great. And so they should never be considered to be a benign organization. They're militant, they're vicious, they're ruthless, maybe not as much today as they were back then. We'll see how much they were back then.
The start of World War I, and it begins on November 2nd, 1914, when Enver Pasha went to the Ottoman Armenians to take up arms against the Russian Armenians. And what happens? And when do they declare a jihad against Christians?
Okay, so on the 2nd November 1914, the Ottoman Empire enters the First World War on the side of Austria and Germany. So Germany is a Lutheran state. Austria was a Catholic state. The Ottomans joined them in their war. The Ottoman decision to enter the side of the Allied powers was mostly because the small Christian states in the Balkans were the enemies of the Austrians, for example, Serbia. And Serbia was also an enemy of the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottomans wanted revenge. And also because Russia was a big opponent, or I should say competitor in the territory of Armenia with the Ottoman Empire. And so by joining with the enemies of Russia against them, they felt that they could advance their territorial causes. However, the decision to enter the First World War was the worst decision ever made in the Ottoman Empire, and it led to the destruction of the empire because they were not a modern state. They hadn't modernized. They didn't have any decent railway system, gun productions, armament factories. They had no modern kind of training for their troops, no kind of modern military organization. So they were whooped. The Russians easily defeated them in battle after battle in the high mountains. And though it was a very bloody and bitter battle and lots of people died on both sides, the Russians end up having the advantage only because what Germany did to Russia in the First World War kept the Russians from really exploiting the situation more in the Caucasus, in Armenia. But right at the beginning, in November of 1914, Shakim Aslam, one of the commanders of the Turkish army, proclaimed a holy war against all Christians in the country, because since their enemy was a Christian country, that is Russia, they saw them at the same thing, because people who are deeply prejudiced can't distinguish between one Christian and another, one that they're fighting for political reasons, and another Christian who might be their ally and has been for centuries living in their own country. A deeply prejudiced Muslim can't see that distinction. So this sets up the stage for the Christian genocide, the Armenian, Assyrian, Syriac genocide.
When does the ethnic removal of all Armenians serving in the Ottoman forces happen? And what happens to them?
Okay, so as part of the war effort, the Ottoman Empire needed to levy its forces, and organize its military, but was afraid that Christians wouldn't fight with them against the Russians. So on the 25th of February 1915, the Ottoman General Staff, for sake of security and precautions, they claim, ordered the removal of all ethnic Armenians serving in the Ottoman forces from their posts and called for their demobilization because they didn't want Armenians with guns in their hands. They were assigned to unarmed labor battalions, and then they accused the Armenian Orthodox Church of giving state secrets to the Russians. And this justified their already prejudicial fear that the Armenians would not be loyal in the war. And they restricted recruitment to only Muslim men in the army. These so-called labor units of unarmed Armenians who had formerly been in the army were eventually all executed. They were assigned to passive unarmed logistic sections of the border, and then done away with quietly. And this was a premeditated strategy of the General Staff and of that secret Young Turk and Masonic Society.
What happened on April 19th, 1950?
So now the genocide begins. On the 19th of April, 1915, Cevdet Bey demanded that the city of Van, that's in the high mountains in eastern Turkey in the center of the ancient kingdom of Armenia, demand that the Armenians give him 4,000 conscripts so he can fight the Russians. Well, it was more than the city could possibly raise. The Christians, and he said, if you don't give me these conscripts, I'll kill every Christian in the city. The Christians raised 500 troops for him. 1,500. But that wasn't enough. So he begins with sieging a city of Van, which was actually part of the Ottoman Empire, attacking the Armenians in his own country. There were 30,000 residents and 15,000 refugees in the city. The Armenians tried to defend it with 1,500 able-bodied men. And the siege lasts until the Russian army makes its way to Van and relieves the Christians. The fact that the Russians liberated the Armenians becomes now the political excuse to exterminate the entire Armenian people as the allies of their enemies.
Here's where it's getting really bad, folks. May of 1915, the death marches begin. Where does Turkey take the Armenian Christians and other Christians? And how do they die?
Okay, so in April already, the government rounded up the top Armenian intellectuals in the country and took them into Ankara and imprisoned them and eventually executed all of them. And there is a very detailed map at Wikipedia under Armenian Genocide that shows you the whole extent of the genocide. It was planned, it was highly organized, it was vicious in every detail. Every single community of Armenians in the country, of Christians in the country, Syrians, was targeted for extermination. The basic tactic is to round up everyone and, if not kill them on the spot, force them to march without any supplies to either ports where they could board ships for Russia, or into the Syrian desert, or to ports where they could board ships to Greece. And they were told they were being allowed to leave. But during these death marches, they're constantly persecuted, robbed, murdered, shot, and raped. It was a general objective of the Central Committee for Union and Progress to see that the Armenian women, who are the most beautiful, be raped 10 to 15 times every day. And most of these women died of absolute despair without anyone to help them. And so there were mass graves dug, huge numbers of Armenians killed. As the persecution goes on, the Ottoman government says that if you, to encourage the persecution, promised Turks the property of the Armenians if they participated in the persecution, and that increased the persecution all more, because the Turks just felt this was, I could rob anything I want. And so a large portion of the Turkish people participated in this genocide willingly, knowingly, freely, and for the most base motives of stealing as much property they could lay their hands on and raping as many women as they could get their hands on. And it was an absolutely horrific event. I would say in many ways it is more cruel than what happened to the Jewish people under the Nazis and other minorities, because this was one that wasn't done by a small group of elite military in secret camps that no one knew about this. This was done in the broad light of day for months on end, with everyone in Turkey knowing what was going on and either participating in actively or making a decision not to do anything to stop it. Okay, so in a much truer sense, the entire Turkish people bear the guilt, but large sections of Turks today who live in the eastern half of Turkey, they're living on property stolen from Armenians. And this is what makes the Turkish government so reluctant to admit genocide, because they'll have to give back what is estimated to be more than $358 billion of real estate that their ancestors stole for the Armenians. And they don't want to do that because, as I said, Islamic religion can't admit that, doesn't have the concept of repentance. If you're guilty of a sin, you must be killed. You just don't repent, you just have to be killed. And so they can't admit fault or guilt about this. But I have not even in the slightest way described the horrors that were suffered by the Armenian people in this thing. Excuse me. You can't even read the Wikipedia article without coming to tears. What these people suffered. Excuse me. At the end of the persecution, the government, to make sure it takes place, sets up concentration camps. They form a special military unit that's designed to make sure that every last Armenian and Christian is put to death. And this Committee of Union and Progress founds an organization to see that this gets done. Thousands of Armenians were burnt alive. Okay, they were shot without any provocation in massacres. The viciousness that was perpetrated on them is just unbelievable. Still others, thousands, were drowned alive on purpose. Some of the young Turks involved in this were physicians, and with the assistance of Turkish doctors, they devised 3 ways to viciously kill Christians. One was to overdose them with morphine. The other was to use toxic gas, and that was used to gas little Armenian children. And the other was to give them intentionally typhoid so they would die of typhoid fever.
Yeah. What type of trials took place after all of this?
So these crimes were so done in the light of day that all the Europeans in Turkey knew what was going on. The Germans knew about it, the Austrians knew about it, the Swedish missionaries knew about it, British officials in the region knew about it, everyone was talking about it. So after the war ended, the Allies insisted that the perpetrators be punished. And a small number of the leaders involved were court-martialed. A few suffered capital punishment. Others were found not guilty. So the Allies, not accepting the trials were done in a sufficient way, take most of these accused military leaders to Malta and put them in a prison. And in a classic Masonic style, one thing leads to another, and they're let go after a few years without ever being punished.
What covert spy operations did the Armenians do in Berlin to get the planners of the Armenian Genocide?
So by the time the 20s come along, the Armenians who did survive the genocide and who were in Europe realized they had to do something on their own. So the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, which was a group of Armenians that wanted vengeance, formed this plot called Operation Nemesis. Okay, and when these guilty military leaders were let go, they tracked them down and assassinated. The most notable assassination took place on the 15th of March 1921, when former Grand Vizier Talat Pasha was assassinated in the Charlottenburg district of Berlin in broad daylight. In the subsequent trial, the assassin Soghomon Telhirian was acquitted, and for lack of evidence. And it's from this trial that one of the lawyers who followed the case goes on later to coin the term genocide when he hears recounted by the defendant what went on in Armenia and what this assassinated individual was really guilty of.
Who got the international aid to come to help the refugees of the Armenian Genocide, and how many did they help?
Yeah, one of the strongest supports given the Armenian people during and after the genocide came from the American Committee for Armenian and Syrian Relief, which was established in September of 1915 as a charitable organization to relieve the suffering peoples of the Near East. They cared for, in their first year, 132,000 Armenian orphans, because many children were left without their parents. They were hidden away so as not to be killed, and their parents never came back for them. So there were hundreds of thousands of these orphans wandering the countryside, and they cared for them in Tiflis, Yerevan, Constantinople, Sivas, Beirut, Damascus, and Jerusalem. They raised $102 million to help Armenians, and that's a vast sum back then. That's like several $billion today. And they helped in between 1915 and 1930 more than 2 million Armenian refugees. Although some of those were helped several times, so it's not a total population.
Once it was over, how many Armenian Christians died? How many survived? And what was the size of the population?
Okay, so the problem in estimating is that no one's certain what the population of Armenians was before the persecution began. But generally speaking, it was estimated to be 1.7 million at 1914. So by 1917, there's only 287,000 Armenians left alive. So we're talking about 1.5 million, roughly, slightly under 1.5 million Armenians were exterminated in this genocide. And this doesn't count nearly 100,000 Syriacs and I think 150,000 Assyrians, Christians, both Christians, but different ethnicity from the Armenians, who also met the same fate.
How many countries and heads of state offered to help the Christians, and why were they turned away?
So a lot of countries knew what was going on, but never took effective measures. The U.S. President spoke against it. Former President Theodore Roosevelt, we talked about in a show on him, spoke out against the genocide. The U.S. Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan complained about it. Ambassador Henry Morgenthau denounced it. But America didn't really take any effort whatsoever. It's not like America was considered a major influential power in that part of the world. The British knew what was going on. Refugees were pouring across the border into British-controlled Mesopotamia. They heard about it, and they complained made lots of complaint. Even Winston Churchill, who had been Secretary of the Navy in the First World War for the British Empire, called it an administrative Holocaust. He said, the clearance of the race from Asia Minor was about as complete as such an act on a scale so great could well be. There is no reasonable doubt that this crime was planned and executed for political reasons. The opportunity presented itself for clearing Turkish soil of a Christian race opposed to all Turkish ambitions, cherishing national ambitions that could only be satisfied at the expense of Turkey, and planted geographically between Turkish and Caucasian Muslims. Toynbee complained about it, the British historian. The Austrian and German officials who were cooperating with the Ottoman ones during the First World War because of an ally, they knew about it, but now we know that the German high command knew the Holocaust was going on and did nothing about it, saying, well, they're our allies and it's a necessary effort of war. So the Nazis did not invent genocide. Genocide was already consented to by the German high command in the First World War. They allowed their ally to do it. And one historian, Professor Wolfgang Wippermann of the Free University of Berlin, has actually traced German officials who were there in the Ottoman Empire and saw the massacres to who in the Second World War under Adolf Hitler participated in genocides in Czechoslovakia. So the German army was very good at studying war and analyzing war. They studied the Holocaust. They knew what the Turks had done to the Christians, and that's how Hitler has the information to plan and orchestrate a Holocaust of Jews and of Poles and many other minorities and ethnicities in the Nazi Reich.
Before we move on to our next topics, I want to thank the actor who did Batman so well, Christian Bale, for liberal Hollywood got really to him. He did that movie, The Promise. I still need to get a copy of the DVD, but if someone brave enough to do that in Hollywood, good job.
Yeah, the persecution of Armenians by the Turks and by the Azerbaijani hasn't ended. I mean, there's a timely story in the United States this morning. An Armenian elementary school in San Francisco was found covered with racist, vicious graffiti, denouncing them, threatening their community, claiming that their land belongs to Turks and Azerbaijanis because Azerbaijan is now involved in a coordinated worldwide effort to harass Turks, harass Armenians, threaten their diplomatic delegations as part of a coordinated pre-war preparation. Looks pretty close that Azerbaijan is going to go on a full-scale war with Armenia in the next few weeks. And it's going to be a war of Muslims against Christians, and the Azerbaijanis have pretty made clear that their intention will be genocide, the extermination of the Armenian people.
Yeah.
And Turkey is an ally of Azerbaijan. The problem with the Armenians is the entire military budget of Azerbaijan is greater than the entire government budget of Armenia. They have no allies in this fight and no one willing to help them arm. So we're going to see some tragic days ahead. God forbid, God willing, the war won't break out. Russia will intercede, or the world powers will intercede, because this time, like under the Ottomans and the Turks, if they don't get help, the Armenian people will suffer horribly.
And this was a statement from last night from the Foreign Ministry of Armenia on this. Recently, we have witnessed the cases and attempts of violence against Armenian citizens and members of Armenian communities in different countries of the world. There have been cases of obstruction of normal work of Armenian diplomatic service abroad in the Armenian communities, as well as deliberate destruction of the personnel and working property, which in some cases have threatened the security of diplomatic staff as well. Discriminatory steps are being taken to disrupt Armenia's trade and economic relations with different countries. Explaining the geography of these actions and the facts of the involvement of Azerbaijani officials in actions against diplomatic missions of Armenia prove that the above-mentioned actions are coordinated by the Azerbaijani official structures. We strongly condemn the instigation of ethnic clashes in different countries, which is another manifestation of Baku irresponsibility, and is fully in line with policy and rhetoric of the Azerbaijani leadership provoking hostility between the two peoples without geographical restrictions. We call on our compatriots to be vigilant, not to give in to any provocation, and in the case of such situations, to immediately contact the local law enforcement bodies, Armenian community structures, diplomatic representatives of Armenia.
Yeah. So I ask everyone to pray for Armenia and Armenians everywhere as they face this threat, and to urge your political leaders everywhere in the world to come to the defense of Armenians, because Christians in the Middle East generally don't get any defense. And as we continue our talk about Islamic terrorism in the 20th century and the 21st century, you'll see that it's just gotten worse. It's not gotten better.
Yeah. And this is another reason why, folks, we need a true Christian party in America.
And why we need to support organizations like Ordo Militaris, which is dedicated to defense of Christians with security and defense services. We're not primarily about helping with humanitarian aids. We're primarily helping defend people from being killed with the use of military force, and founding organizations that do that provide them with security. And without organizations like this, Christians will be persecuted. So that Christians are persecuted in part as a consequence that Christians don't organize to defend Christians like our Lord would want us to do.
Yeah. I'm sure in the coming days and weeks, Armenia would love to have us just join with them. Like, hey, you here to help? Good, we need the numbers.
Yeah, Armenians are Orthodox. They're generally not so friendly to Catholics, but I have spoken to several Armenian Orthodox, and they'd love Ordo Militaris to come and found a chapter there for the Armenians to join as to support them in the defense of their country. But it would take investment. Now, we can sell the stock to found a subsidiary in Armenia, but we don't have the capital. So if there's anyone who loves Armenians out there who would like to invest with us, this is one way you can do it legally and help your people in this time.
Yeah. And right, and doing the research of the trilogy of the Journey to Save Jerusalem, learn about how I'm also connected to the Armenians through the marriage that Baldwin's the brother of Godfrey of Bouillon was had to do. So
yeah, he married an Armenian princess. Mm-hmm.
there's also adopted too. So
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Adopted by the father-in-law. Mm-hmm.
However that all works out. So yeah. if you can invest, please do so.
Yeah, and if you're interested in investing, you go to ordomilitaris.us. Same as ordomilitaris.net with the hyphen, but it's .us, and go to our investment page, and you can learn about our stock offerings. You would be interested in the T offering, which we would use for foreign investments.
All right, we're going to a Gatestone Institute report about a year after the martyrdom of Father Jacques Hamel, August 31st, 2017. Has France been bought by a state sponsor of Islamic terrorism? Oh, buddy.
Yeah. Well, read some of that so that people know what's going on.
The state of Qatar has been officially labeled as the state sponsor of terrorism in an active support of Islamic terrorist organizations such as the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, and the Islamic State, not by Western governments, but by Saudi Arabia, the cradle of Islamic faith and other Islamic regimes of the region. Knowing the facts of Qatar was 11,000 kilometers square, one-third size of Belgium, population 2.5 million. The question may seem far-fetched. How could France, the great France, possibly be bought by a tiny state such as Qatar? For the single reason that, thanks to its huge gas and oil reserves, Qatar has the highest per capita income in the world and huge reserves of cash to invest everywhere, whereas France, thanks to 40 years of socialism, is in dire need of cash and has a tradition of corruptible officials, to say nothing of the
propensity
for collaboration. On August 4th, the English press, not the French press, revealed that French prosecutors are actively investigating two events: the awarding of the 2022 World Cup of soccer to Qatar, and the purchase by Qatari Diar, a state-owned investment company, of a stake in the French utility firm Veolia. At the center of the investigation is the former French President Nicolas Sarkozy. To be sure, Sarkozy has not been formally indicted, and he may never be, but the evidence is overwhelming. First, the World Cup. That the state of Qatar, known for decades for its active support of Islamic terror organizations, and with a temperature among the highest in the world, in addition to zero tradition in the world of football, was awarded the 2022 World Cup, is, of course, a source of wonder ever since the award was announced by FIFA, the international governing body of football. French investigators are now looking into the meeting that took place between then-President Sarkozy, Michel Platini, the French former president of the Union of European Football Association, or UEFA, who sat on the FIFA committee that chose Qatar, and the Qatari officials on November 23, 2010, 10 days before the vote. It is alleged that Platini was dead set against Qatar, and that Sarkozy urged him to change his mind. They are good people, he said. The deal.
Yeah. Go ahead. You can go ahead.
Okay. The deal is said to have been sealed when Qatar agreed to buy the biggest French soccer team, Paris Saint-Germain. You gave them the city team?
It's a general strategy of radical Islamic Islam to buy soccer teams in Europe, because since people are so affectionate for their soccer team, once it falls in Islamic hands, they can slowly introduce the Islamic religion into the city, into the population, and into the youth, so that famous soccer players who are Muslims can encourage young Europeans who are Christians to convert to Islam. That's the whole strategy. And it's very devious, it's very insidious. The other strategy is to buy shopping malls, huge shopping malls, and that way they persecute any businessman who's a Christian, run him out of business in town, and only allow pro-Islamic or actual Muslims to run stores and gain control of the economy. That's their other strategy. But I think you uncovered something about what Saudi Arabia has been doing since the 60s with their oil money to spread a jihad around the world.
Let me see. Let me get that back up here. All right. There we go. All right.
Let me preface this by saying that during the Second World War, British oil companies, or even before it, discovered huge amounts of oil and natural gas in the Mideast, in the Persian Gulf, in the territory of what we now call Saudi Arabia. It was land where no one had ever lived. It's a complete desert, and no one owned it. The British Empire, which was famous for traveling around the world and claiming unknown land for themselves, could have easily claimed this land for themselves. But the Masons saw an advantage by giving this land to a small, tiny little radical Islamic dynasty on the other side of the peninsula, and giving them the claim of most of the whole peninsula as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
They could make an enemy of Christianity super wealthy, and who would use that wealth for the destruction of Christianity and the ultimate aims of Freemasonry. And so they gave them the oil in the Mideast. And so,
Yeah. Islamist movements from the 1960s. With the defeat in June 1967 of the Arab states by Israel and the Six-Day June War, socialist and pan-Arab ideologies declined in the Islamic world, while political Islam emerged as a public force. Egypt, which had been under the influence of the Soviet Union since the mid-1950s, withdrew from military and other treaties with the Soviets in the 1970s under President Anwar el-Sadat. A new alliance between Egypt and Saudi Arabia, fostered by economic assistance to Egypt from Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing Persian Gulf states, altered the geopolitical map of Islam, led to the new religious dynamics. In 1962, the Saudi regime established the Muslim World League in Mecca, with the participation of Muslim scholars and intellectuals from all over the world. The League, whose mission was to unify Muslims and promote the spread of Islam, opened offices in the Islamic world in the 1960s, in the West in the subsequent decades. With the financial assistance as well as the religious guidance from the League, new Islamic organizations were created by revivalist movements in the Islamic world and by immigrant Muslim communities in Europe and America.
yeah, and Saudi Arabia has been a big promoter of that. So has United Arab Emirates. They go around buying Catholic churches and turning them into mosques as a part of their jihad. A lot of the radical Muslim terrorists begin their radicalization in mosques that are funded by Saudi Arabia around the world, all around Eastern Africa or in the Maldives, in Egypt, all around the world. This is the big cause why there's so much terrorism, but that's not the only thing. We have Islamic terrorism that's promoted by Western governments. ISIS was created by the CIA under Obama, who was raised a Muslim and said he would always defend Muslims, and used to terrorize the people of Syria and kill tens of, if not hundreds of thousands of Muslims and Christians. And they were supplied, they were organized, they were funded, they were supported, and they were given free rein by the United States government. And this is something no one was willing to talk about, but the U.S. owes massive financial reparations to Syria and to the Christians of the Mideast for their support of ISIS. And whether they're still supporting ISIS or not is not so clear, but they did support ISIS under the previous administration, and America needs to fess up on that and clean the record. And Obama should be brought to trial for crimes against humanity, he and his entire administration. And when we get a true president that's truly for the defense of America and to make America great again, you will see Obama tried for crimes against humanity and for war crimes. But until then, he will get a pass because everyone is his friend.
Yeah. Next report from Gatestone is from October 31st, 2017, by Judas Bergman. In the title, Surprise! Study shows Islamic terrorism is Islamic.
Yeah. Now, the effort in modern times to convince everyone that Islam is a religion of peace, is just tremendous. It's just so shocking. You see it everywhere. You can see it in the article at Wikipedia on jihad. It's an extremely long article. You would think, okay, if it's about jihad, it's going to tell me about all the jihads in history. No, the article's all about the word jihad, not the actual action, as if there never was any jihad in history. Okay, it's only a word, and you're misunderstanding it. And they actually have the goal to say that the word jihad is found in the Quran without any military connotations. But they do admit that originally all Muslims thought the word as meaning a war, a holy war.
Mm-hmm.
But after the physical descendants of Muhammad died out because the Sunni killed most of them who were Shia, and there could no longer be a caliph, Muslims started doubting their own religion and gave up jihad as a war as a general principle and tried to spiritualize it into an internal struggle. But that's not the original meaning of the word. And only in recent decades have Islamic scholars gone back to the original text and with modern academic training realized that that's the original word meant war to spread Islam. Doesn't mean internal struggle because Islam is, if you read any part of the Quran, you can see it has nothing to do with spirituality. It's all about bestiality, murder, greed, rape, and theft, and genocide, because Muhammad did wipe out a whole Jewish tribe for refusing to become Muslim. So the Freemasons push this idea that jihad is not about war, and Muslims aren't all radical Islamic terrorists. It's only a very small few of them that have the mistaken notion that the medieval concept of jihad is the right one, when that never was the true concept, which is just a bunch of baloney. It was the original concept, and you just read the Quran. I mean, unless you're illiterate, you believe that. But generally speaking, Wikipedia tries to push the Masonic spiel about jihad and try to make you think that the word means 10,000 things, and that it means holy war is only in your mind, you know, or it's only something in the U.S. State Department's conception of the world.
I was just reading the very first line of this. Oh boy. Western leaders insist that Islamic terrorism has nothing to do with Islam. Evidence to the contrary appeared again this week from Mohammed Jamal Kawisi, an ISIS recruit from the United States who said in a 2016 interview with Kurdistan 24, "Our daily life was basically prayer, eating, learning about religion for about 8 hours." Kawais was sentenced to 20 years in prison on October 27th for providing material support to ISIS, according to CBS News. As early as 2001, immediately after 9/11, then President George Bush gave a speech in which he claimed that the United States, the terrorist acts in which over 3,000 people were killed, violate the fundamental tenets of Islamic faith, and that Islam is peace. 12 years later, and many spectacular terrorist attacks later, in 2013, when two jihadists murdered the British soldier Lee Ridgeby in broad daylight in London and beheaded him. The Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, declared that the attack was a betrayal of Islam. There is nothing in Islam that justifies this truly dreadful act. In January 2015, jihadists in Paris shouting "Allahu Akbar" attacked Charlie Hebdo in a kosher supermarket, murdering 15 people. French President Francois Hollande said that jihadists had nothing to do with the Muslim faith. 2 years later, when a jihadist targeted the very heart of European democratic civilization, the House of Parliament in Westminster Bridge, British Prime Minister Theresa May said, "It is wrong to describe this as an Islamic terrorism. It is Islamist terrorism and the perversion of a great faith." In the face of hundreds of Muslim terrorists yelling "Allahu Akbar," while bombing, shooting, stabbing, car ramming thousands of innocent civilians to death, and wounding thousands of others, it would be reasonable to assume that elected representatives might feel obliged to put their denial of reality on hold long enough to read at least bits of the Quran. They might start by reading the command and fight and kill the disbelievers wherever you find them. Yeah. Or so fight them until there is no more strife and all submit to the religion of Allah.
This is absolutely true. I mean, all these radical Islamic terrorists, they're not Christians, they're not Hindus, they're not Buddhists. They'll openly tell you they're a Muslim, and the reason why they're doing it is the teaching of the Quran. So the claim that they have nothing to do with the religion of Islam is just absurd. However, we have to admit that many of them are instruments of Western intelligence agencies. For example, whenever there's elections in England in the last few years, you always have Islamic terrorists come out and kill people in the street. And it only happens right before parliamentary elections.
Mm-hmm.
So does that have something to do with Islam? Sounds to me that has something to do with the deep state. Even the Charlie Hebdo massacre. Weeks before, who bought that magazine? The Rothschilds. And then after the attack and all those people were killed, the Rothschilds decided to run a commemorative issue, and they made a sack of money on that commemorative issue. Then they shut down the magazine, sold to someone else, and made a lot of money on that sale. So it served them very well. The same thing under Barack Obama. There were lots of terrorist attacks here and there that to make people think there was a war on terror. But in many cases, these people were protected by the government. ISIS fighters come back from Syria and are given free housing, free welfare, free social security in most Western countries by the very governments that supported ISIS in the war against Syria. So tell me they're not part of the deep state. That's because the Masons and radical Islam are in a close alliance, because there are Freemasons even among Islam. Okay, if Masons object to organizations like ISIS, it's only because ISIS is more religious than them, because Masons are generally atheistic or satanic in what they worship. But the spirit behind both is Satan. It's the same God. Okay, though Satan is not a God, he's a fallen angel. So in some ways it has to do with Islam, but in other ways it does. So we can't deny it. Even I use the phrase radical Islamic terrorists just to point out who we're talking about. Okay, because there are many Muslims who don't believe in Islam and yet still call themselves Muslims because they're afraid of fellow Muslims who'd persecute them. Then there's other Muslims that, just will say they're Muslim and practice a little of it, but really don't believe much of it. There are those who truly believe it and are in favor of expanding Islam, some by all means, some by only some means. And there's others who are really in favor of the absolute violence and terrorism. But since the Islamic society is coercive, manipulative, it follows groupthink, the Muslims who are really wouldn't ever get involved in terrorism and are against it are pressured to keep silent and do nothing about it, so that the evil reigns in an Islamic society, because the whole religion is geared to threatening everyone so that evil should reign. It's very different from Christian society. It's the exact opposite, in fact.
You want to read all these reports that got leaked on the show page for today? They're there.
Well, we should mention 9/11. Okay, so 3,000 people were killed on 9/11, and that was by Al Qaeda, who we know were trained by the CIA. And whether they did it on their own or was a state thing, there's a debate about it. Initially speaking, I just thought absolutely absurd that the deep state should have any interest in it. But it caused the military-industrial establishment to make a big wad of money on the so-called war of terrorism. It gave nations, Masonic nations around the world, an excuse to start putting us all under surveillance. And it was the absolutely necessary prior step to advancing Islam under the pretext that people who are afraid of Islamic terrorists are bigoted or Islamophobes, and preparing for the COVID stunt, which has locked down people in their homes all around the world and seems to be getting worse in some countries on a daily basis, not the least of which is the United States, which is total madness, and no one would have even contemplated that in 1999 under Bill Clinton. So the Republicans have been behind this at every step, just as much as the Democrats. But the only difference is that Obama was willing to fund and support and create ISIS, and Trump was about bombing them out of existence, at least in parts of the Mideast, while claiming victory and then allowing them to continue on in Iraq.
Yeah. And seeing all the evidence about the towers, I was like, what? You're right. How can airliner jets bring down those big old buildings?
I do believe airline jets could bring down. You remember those airline jets had tanks full of petroleum, jet fuel, which is highly flammable. The buildings are modern buildings and they're not built to withstand that kind of attack, and they can easily pancake. The question is why the FBI, who knew about these people, weren't watching them. Okay, the FBI, I'm pretty sure, knew there was going to be a terrorist attack, and some people in the State Department were concerned about it, because in August, just before 9/11, in August of that year, I had spent some weeks in Quebec, and I hitchhiked my way back home to my family relatives there in Massachusetts. And when I came across the border in New Hampshire, I was very closely checked by the border security guard, because at that time I wore a Franciscan beard and I have my habit on, so I might have appeared to be a radical Muslim to someone, and they really grilled me. They looked at my passport, they looked at everything very closely, and they not only let me, but they finally let me through. But for the next 120 miles, as I was hitchhiking through New Hampshire, the police were following me. So they were very well aware that there was some kind of terrorist thing going on. But they didn't really, they're looking at Christian monks crossing the border. They weren't looking at Muslims in flight schools training to fly planes when there's no reason for them to learn how to fly a plane in the USA, and letting them on board at the last moment without any security checking them or anything, and not putting armed sheriffs on planes, or because the attack on the trade towers with planes was something that was already spoken of in Hollywood, as Obama bin Laden said, if you want to learn how to attack America, just watch movies from Hollywood. That's kind of like coded language is saying MK Ultra is going to tell you how to do it through their control of Hollywood. So just watch the movies and you'll be told how to do it. And though we couldn't see that then, now it's a bit more clear.
Yeah. So we will be having a special Sunday show tomorrow for the anniversary of Father Jacques Hamel's martyrdom. We'll tell you about his life, his death, and any other new details that came out.
Yeah, it will be a great day. Father Jacques Hamel's death was the occasion of the inspiration for Ordo Militaris Catholicus, the fact that Catholic clergy and Catholic people and Christians everywhere need defense of, and they're not receiving it from Western states or most states, and therefore Christians should organize the defense. That's our inspiration. So He is clearly a martyr. He's not been canonized by the church, but and so we don't organize private devotions to him of any kind, but we admire his charity, his tolerance, and yet his staunch faith in the last moments of his life.
If you like our programs and want a little bit better video quality without the latency of my camera, you can help out by going to any of the show topics. Click there, go all the way down to the bottom. You'll see a blue-green button. You follow the steps to either be a one-time donor or a monthly donor. That is at ordl-militaris.net. And also we can find the support button on the menu bar. We'll have the two side by side. You just click one of the blue-green buttons and follow the steps. Also, you can get some merchandise from the Teespring store, which is also on the menu bar. That is called Order Militaris Radio Store, and please do so. And you can also get the Gone Forlorn flag behind Brother.
Yeah, so if you go to ordo-militaris.us, you can get a copy of this flag that's 1 meter by 1.8 meters. It was flown at the Battle of Lepanto. You can read the story there. And I encourage anyone, all the listeners, to share this program on social media so other people get to know of Ordo Militaris Radio. I want to thank the one individual who's pledged $20 a month. But you can see that AJ and I do a lot more work. We don't get any salary for what we're doing. This is a true apostolate. And we need your support because, I think we merit it by what we're doing, but we have expenses and someone has to pay them. And I, as a Franciscan, have no salary. AJ is a homebound handicap, doesn't have a salary. So what we're giving already is our time and our talents. We ask you consider pledging something small monthly so that we can meet our budget and pay for the expenses and give you better service and better programming, and bring on some other talk hosts to do more programming during the day and during the week.
This is Ordo Militaris Radio TV signing off. Davis Volt.
Deus Volt.